Welcome to a chapter a day. You've been told your entire life that holding on is strength, that persistence is power, that the ones who don't give up are the ones who win. But here's the truth no one told you. Holding on is often the very thing keeping you stuck. Not because you're weak, but because you've already outgrown what you're trying to hold together. And something strange happens when that's true. The tighter you hold on, the more everything begins to fall apart. The relationship becomes chaotic. The opportunity feels heavy. The environment starts resisting you. You call it bad luck. You call it stress. But what if it's something else? What if it's expansion trying to happen and you're blocking it? Because here's the deeper truth. You're not trying to build a new life. You're trying to enter a new timeline. And timelines don't respond to effort. They respond to alignment, which means this changes everything. The fastest way to receive what you want is not to chase it. It's to release what no longer matches who you've become. Now pause for a moment and think about this. How many things in your life right now feel forced? How many situations require constant effort just to maintain? How many relationships feel like they used to fit, but don't anymore? That's not failure, that's evidence. Evidence that your identity has already shifted, and your reality just hasn't caught up yet. In this audiobook, you're going to understand something most people never realize. Letting go is not loss, it's access. Access to a version of your life that cannot appear until you stop gripping the one you've already outgrown. And once you see this, you'll never hold on the same way again. Take a moment and really look at your life as it is right now, not how you want it to be, not how you explain it to other people, but how it actually feels to live it, day after day. Because if you're honest, there are areas in your life that feel heavy. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just heavy. Things that require effort just to maintain. Conversations that feel like work. Responsibilities that drain more than they give. Situations where you are constantly trying to make it work. Now here's the part that most people miss. That feeling you've been calling stress might actually be a signal. A very specific signal. Friction is feedback, and the moment you begin to understand that, everything starts to change. Because we've been conditioned to interpret friction the wrong way. We've been taught, if it's hard, it must be worth it. If it's difficult, you should push harder. If it's not working, try more. But pause for a moment and think about this. How many times have you pushed harder, only to feel more resistance? How many times have you given more energy, only to feel less return? How many times have you stayed committed, while everything inside you quietly started pulling away? That's not coincidence. That's not bad luck. That's misalignment. And here's the truth that may feel uncomfortable at first. If it requires force, it's no longer yours. Let that sink in. Not because you failed, not because you didn't try hard enough, but because you have changed. Your identity has shifted. Your standards have evolved. Your energy is no longer compatible with what you're holding on to. And yet, you keep holding. Why? Because somewhere along the way, you learned to confuse effort with value. You learned to believe that struggle equals meaning. So when something becomes difficult, you don't question the alignment. You question yourself. You think, maybe I need to try harder. Maybe I need to fix this. Maybe I'm the problem. But what if you're not the problem? What if the effort itself is the evidence? Evidence that something has already run its course. Now think about a relationship that feels forced. At one point, it was easy. Conversation flowed. Presence felt natural. There was no need to overthink. And then something changed. Now every interaction feels calculated, You're choosing your words carefully. You're trying to maintain something that used to exist effortlessly. And the more you try, the more unnatural it becomes. That's not something breaking, that's something ending. But instead of recognizing the ending, you apply more force. And that force creates resistance. The same thing happens in work. There are roles, environments, and paths that once felt aligned. You were engaged, you were growing, you were energized, but now it feels like obligation. You wake up already tired. You push through the day instead of moving with it. You convince yourself this is just what responsibility feels like. But pause again and really consider this. What if responsibility is not supposed to feel like resistance? What if the version of you that chose this path is not the version of you who exists today? And now you're trying to force continuity where evolution is required. This is where most people get stuck. They don't recognize that life has seasons. And more importantly, they don't recognize when a season has already ended. So they keep showing up long after the alignment is gone. And slowly, friction increases. Effort increases. Emotional exhaustion increases. Until eventually, something gives. But here's the deeper mechanism behind all of this. And you may not have noticed this before. Flow is not random. Flow is feedback. When something flows, it means there is alignment between who you are and what you're engaging with. There is no internal conflict, no forced energy, no resistance, just movement. But when something requires force, that's feedback too. It's not telling you to try harder. It's telling you, this no longer matches you. And this is where a major shift has to happen in how you think. Ease is not laziness. Ease is intelligence, because ease means you are operating in alignment. It means your energy is being used efficiently. It means you are moving with your natural direction instead of against it. Now ask yourself this. Where in your life are you ignoring ease? Where are you choosing force? Because you've been taught that force is noble. And what is it costing you? Energy, clarity, peace, maybe even time you can't get back. Because every moment you spend forcing something is a moment you are not available for something that would naturally flow. Let that land. You're not just holding on to the wrong thing, you're blocking the right thing. And that's where this becomes real, because this isn't just about discomfort, it's about opportunity. It's about what cannot enter your life, while your hands are full, gripping what no longer belongs. Now here's a question that might shift something for you. What if you stopped trying to fix what feels forced, and instead got curious about what feels easy? Not easy because it's simple, but easy because it fits. Because there are areas in your life, even now, where things work, where conversations feel natural, where ideas flow, where effort doesn't drain you, it expands you. That's alignment. And alignment doesn't need force, it needs trust. But here's where it gets interesting. Because once you stop forcing, something unexpected happens. There's space, and at first, that space can feel uncomfortable. Because you've been used to filling it with effort, with control, with trying. So when you stop, it can feel like nothing is happening. But that's not true. Something is happening. You're creating room. Room for clarity, room for direction, room for something new to emerge. And most people never reach that point because they never stop forcing long enough to experience it. So instead, they stay in cycles. Force, resistance, exhaustion, repeat. Force, resistance, exhaustion, repeat. And they call that life, but it's not life. It's misalignment on autopilot. Now pause again, just for a moment. And ask yourself honestly, what am I currently forcing that no longer feels natural? Don't analyze it. Don't justify it. Just notice it. Because awareness is the first release. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. Which brings us to something even deeper. Because recognizing force is only the beginning. The real question is, why do you keep holding on, even after you feel the misalignment? Because if it's no longer flowing, and you can feel that, why doesn't it end? Why does it continue? Why do you stay? That's what we're about to uncover next. Because the truth is, it's not about the situation. It's about the moment you knew and didn't act. You've just identified where you're forcing what no longer flows. You've felt the friction. You've seen the misalignment. You've recognized the cost of holding on. But awareness alone doesn't create change. Because there's a moment, a very specific moment, where everything becomes clear. And most people ignore it. Not because they don't see it, but because they don't trust it. So now the question becomes, when did you first know it was over? And why did you stay? Let's go deeper. Chapter 2. Recognize the exact moment it's already over. There is a moment in every experience that doesn't look dramatic. There's no loud ending, no clear announcement, no visible collapse. And yet, something quietly shifts. Not outside of you, inside of you. It's subtle at first, easy to overlook, easy to explain away. But if you slow down and really feel into your life, you'll realize something that changes everything. Things don't end when they fall apart. They end when they stop evolving. Let that settle, because most people are waiting for an ending that is obvious. They wait for the argument, the breakup, the burnout, the moment where everything becomes undeniable. But by the time that happens, the truth is, it's already been over for a long time. Now pause for a moment and think about something in your life that feels uncertain right now. A relationship, a path, an environment. And instead of asking, is this going to end? Ask a different question. When was the last time this actually grew? Not improved temporarily, not felt better for a moment, but truly expanded. When was the last time it challenged you in a way that elevated you? When was the last time it inspired you? When was the last time it felt alive? If you have to think too hard about the answer, that's your answer. Because growth has a feeling. It feels expansive, it feels engaging, it feels like movement. And when that feeling disappears, something important has already changed. But here's where it gets deeper. Because even when growth stops, the structure often remains. The relationship continues, the job still exists, the routine stays intact. So externally, everything looks the same, but internally, you feel the difference. And that creates tension, a quiet kind of tension that follows you. You can't always explain it, but you feel it in small moments. When conversations feel repetitive, when your energy drops in certain environments, when you start questioning things you used to accept without thought. That's not confusion, that's awareness trying to surface. But most people don't trust that feeling, so they override it. They tell themselves, maybe I'm overthinking, maybe this is just a phase, maybe I need to give it more time. And time passes, but nothing changes. Because the issue isn't time, the issue is truth. And here's the psychological twist that most people never fully accept. You're not waiting for clarity. You already feel it. You're just not acting on it. Let that land. Because that changes the entire narrative. You're not lost. You're not confused. You're not uncertain. You're aware. But you're hesitating. And that hesitation creates a very specific experience. You stay physically present in something you've already left emotionally. And that split, that's where discomfort is born. Because now you're living in two realities at once. One that still exists in your external world, and one that has already shifted internally. And the longer you stay in that split, the more tension you feel. This is why things start to feel draining. Not because the situation is inherently bad, but because it no longer matches you. Now here's something to really think about. Have you ever noticed how, once you feel that shift, you can't fully go back? You can try. You can act the same, respond the same, show up the same, but something feels off. Because awareness changes your relationship with everything. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. And this is the exact moment most people ignore. Not because they don't recognize it, but because they don't want what it implies. Because if you admit that something has stopped growing, then you have to face what comes next. And what comes next is letting go. So instead, you negotiate. You try to recreate what used to exist. You try to revive the old energy. You try to convince yourself it's still there. But here's the truth. You cannot grow something that has already completed its purpose. You can maintain it. You can extend it. You can delay the ending. But you cannot make it evolve again if the alignment is gone. Now pause again and be honest with yourself. Where in your life are you trying to revive something, instead of recognizing that it's already complete? Because completion doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes it looks like repetition. Sometimes it looks like nothing changing, no matter how much effort you apply. And that's where clarity actually lives. Not in chaos, but in stagnation. Because stagnation is not neutral. Stagnation is a signal that growth has already moved elsewhere, and now you're being invited to follow it. But here's where it becomes uncomfortable. Because even when something is over internally, it often still exists externally. You still have the job, you're still in the relationship, you're still in the environment. So logically, you tell yourself, if it's still here, it must not be over. But energetically, you feel the truth. And this creates one of the most important questions in this entire journey. If it's already over within you, why does it still exist around you? Why hasn't it ended? Why hasn't it disappeared? Why are you still in it? This is where most people misunderstand how change actually happens. Because life doesn't remove things the moment they become misaligned. It gives you a window, a space between awareness and action. A moment where you can choose to release or choose to stay. And what you do in that space determines everything. Because if you act on the awareness, transition becomes smooth, aligned, intentional, clean. But if you ignore it, that's when friction begins to build. That's when things start to feel heavier, more complicated, more emotionally charged. Not because life is punishing you, but because you're resisting the shift that has already begun. And the longer you resist, the louder the signals become, until eventually they're impossible to ignore. But it doesn't have to reach that point, because right now, you're in the moment that matters most. The moment of recognition, the moment where you can say, I see it, I feel it. I know this has stopped growing. And instead of waiting for confirmation, you trust the awareness itself. Because that awareness, that is the confirmation. And once you begin to trust that, everything starts to change. You stop waiting for endings. You start recognizing them. You stop needing collapse. You start moving with clarity, and most importantly, you stop holding on to things that have already completed their role in your life. Which brings us back to the core truth of this entire journey. Letting go is not something you do randomly. It's something you do when you recognize that something is already over. Not visibly, but energetically. And once you see that clearly, holding on no longer feels like loyalty. It feels like resistance. You've now seen the moment. Not the dramatic ending, but the quiet internal shift where growth stopped and awareness began. You've recognized that clarity was never missing. It was just ignored. But now a deeper question emerges. If you've already outgrown something internally, yet it still exists externally, what does that actually mean? Are you stuck, or is something else happening beneath the surface? Because what if you're not trapped at all? What if you've already moved, and your reality just hasn't caught up yet? Let's go deeper. Chapter 3. You're not stuck. You're split between timelines. There's a feeling that many people quietly carry, but rarely know how to explain. It feels like being in between, not where you used to be, but not fully where you're going either. You wake up, and something feels different, but nothing around you has changed. Your environment is the same. The people are the same. Your routine looks familiar, and yet you don't feel the same inside it. At first, you might interpret this as confusion. You might think, something is wrong with me. Why can't I just feel settled? Why can't I go back to how things were? But what if that feeling is not confusion at all? What if it's awareness of something deeper? Because here's what's actually happening. And you may not have heard it explained this way before. You're not stuck. You're split. Split between two versions of reality, one that still exists physically, and one you've already stepped into internally. This is what we'll call timeline drift. And once you understand this, so much of your frustration begins to make sense. Because timeline drift happens the moment your identity shifts. Not when your circumstances change, not when your environment updates, but when you change. Your perspective evolves, your standards rise, your energy recalibrates. And in that moment, you are no longer the same person who created your current life. Let that sink in. Because most people assume their external world defines them, but in reality, your identity is the blueprint, and your reality is the reflection. So when the blueprint changes, the reflection doesn't update instantly. There's a delay, a gap, a space where your internal world has already moved forward, but your external world is still catching up. And that gap, that's where discomfort lives. That's where people say, I feel stuck. I feel lost. I don't know what's wrong, but nothing is wrong. You're just witnessing the lag between who you were and who you've become. Now pause for a moment and think about your life again. Where do you feel this gap the most? Where do you feel like you've outgrown something, but you're still physically in it? Maybe it's a conversation that no longer interests you. Maybe it's a role that no longer challenges you. Maybe it's an environment that no longer reflects your energy. And every time you engage with it, you feel that subtle resistance. Not because it's terrible, but because it's no longer you. And this is where a powerful question emerges. Are you trying to stay loyal to a version of yourself that no longer exists? Really think about that. Because loyalty sounds noble, it feels responsible, it feels grounded, but sometimes loyalty becomes limitation. Because you're not being loyal to growth, you're being loyal to familiarity, to identity patterns that once made sense, but no longer align with who you are now. And the cost of that loyalty is stagnation. Because you cannot fully step into your next level while trying to preserve your previous one. It doesn't work. It creates internal conflict. You start negotiating with yourself. Part of you wants expansion. Part of you wants comfort. Part of you feels the shift. Part of you resists it. And so you hover in between, not moving backward, but not fully moving forward either. That's not being stuck. That's being divided. Now here's something even deeper. Because when you're in this split, you may start trying to fix your current life. You might think, maybe I just need to adjust things. Maybe I need a better mindset. Maybe I need to optimize what I already have. But here's the truth. You don't need to fix your life. You need to match your new frequency. Because the life you're trying to fix was built by a previous version of you. And that version of you no longer exists. So no matter how much you adjust it, it will never fully align. It might improve temporarily. It might feel slightly better for a moment. But that deeper sense of misalignment will remain. Because you're trying to repair something that was never designed for who you've become. Now imagine this. Imagine upgrading your entire identity. Your mindset, your standards, your awareness. But continuing to live inside a structure built for your old self. It would feel limiting, restrictive, outdated. Not because the structure is bad, but because it's no longer compatible. And that's exactly what timeline drift creates. It reveals the mismatch, not to frustrate you, but to guide you, to show you where you've already moved beyond. But here's where most people hesitate. Because recognizing this means accepting something important. You're no longer who you used to be. And while that sounds empowering, it can also feel destabilizing, because if you're not that person anymore, then what does that mean for everything connected to that identity? Your relationships, your habits, your choices. Everything begins to feel uncertain. So instead of stepping forward, you try to hold both. You try to be who you were, while becoming who you're meant to be. And that tension, that's what drains you. That's what creates confusion. That's what makes life feel heavier than it should. But the moment you understand this, the moment you truly see what's happening, something shifts. You stop labeling yourself as stuck. You stop trying to fix what feels off. And instead, you recognize the truth. You've already moved. Now your reality just needs to catch up. And here's the key. Reality doesn't catch up through force. It catches up through alignment, through decisions, through release, through allowing your external world to reorganize around your new identity, which means the discomfort you feel right now, it's not a problem. It's a signal that your expansion has already begun. And your only job is to stop anchoring yourself to what no longer matches it. Because the moment you do, things begin to shift faster. Opportunities start appearing. Connections begin changing. New paths become visible, not because you forced them, but because you finally aligned with them. And this brings us back to the core idea we've been building. Letting go is not about losing something valuable. It's about no longer holding yourself in a place you've already outgrown. And once you truly understand that, letting go doesn't feel like risk. It feels like relief. You now understand something most people never fully see. You're not stuck. You've already shifted. Your identity has moved forward, and your reality is in the process of catching up. But now we need to go deeper. Because if that's true, then something else must also be true. If you've already moved forward internally, and you continue holding on to what no longer aligns, what effect does that actually have? Because here's where it gets counterintuitive. The more tightly you hold on to something that no longer matches you, the faster it begins to slip away. Not slowly, not subtly, but in ways that feel confusing and sometimes even painful. So now the question becomes, Are you really holding it together? Or are you unintentionally pushing it away? Let's uncover the truth. Chapter 4. Holding on is pushing it away. Faster. There is a paradox that quietly shapes almost every area of your life. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. It goes against what you've been taught. It challenges what feels natural. And yet, it explains why so many things fall apart. Right when you try the hardest to hold them together, here it is. The tighter you hold on, the faster it slips away. Pause for a moment and really feel that. Because at first, it doesn't make sense. Holding on should create stability. Holding on should protect what matters. Holding on should keep things from falling apart. But in reality, holding on often creates the very outcome you're trying to avoid. Now think about a time when you felt like you were losing something. Maybe it was a relationship. At first, things were natural, effortless, unforced. There was space, but the moment you felt it shifting, something changed in you. You became more aware, more focused, more attached. You started thinking more about what to say, how to act, how to keep things the way they were. And without realizing it, you began tightening your grip. You gave more attention, more energy, more effort, not from alignment, but from fear. Fear of losing it, fear of it ending, fear of what that would mean. And here's what's interesting. The more you tried to hold it together, the more tension entered the dynamic. Conversations felt heavier, interactions felt pressured. The natural flow began to disappear, and eventually, the very thing you were trying to preserve began to collapse. Not because you didn't care enough, but because you cared in a way that created pressure instead of space. This doesn't just happen in relationships. It happens with money. The more tightly you grip it, the more fear surrounds it. You begin monitoring it constantly, worrying about losing it, restricting yourself from trusting flow. And that fear-based control, it limits movement, it blocks opportunity, it creates contraction instead of expansion. The same pattern shows up with control in general. The more you try to control every outcome, the less flexible you become, the less open you are to change, the less able you are to adapt. And life doesn't respond well to rigidity. Life responds to movement, to openness, to alignment. So when you grip too tightly, you don't create security. You create resistance. And resistance always leads to one thing: breakdown. Now here's the deeper layer. Because this isn't just about behavior, it's about energy. When you hold on to something tightly, you're not just physically maintaining it, you're emotionally attaching to it. You're saying, on a deeper level, I need this to stay. I can't lose this. This defines something important about me. And that energy, it's heavy, it's restrictive, it carries fear, and fear changes how you show up. It makes you overthink, overreact, overextend, and all of that pushes against the natural flow of things. Because flow requires space. Flow requires trust. Flow requires a level of detachment that allows movement. But when you're gripping tightly, there is no space. There is only pressure. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself honestly, where in your life are you gripping too tightly? Where are you trying to control the outcome instead of allowing it to unfold? Where are you holding on? Not because it feels right, but because it feels necessary. And what does that feel like in your body? Tension, anxiety, restlessness. That's not alignment. That's attachment driven by fear. And here's the paradox again. The more you try to keep something out of fear, the more that fear begins to shape the experience. Until eventually, what you feared becomes real. Not because it was inevitable, but because your energy aligned with losing it. Now this is where a shift becomes possible, because once you see this pattern, you can start to change how you engage with it. And this is your coaching moment. Not to detach completely, not to become indifferent, but to do something far more powerful. Loosen your grip while maintaining your vision. This is the balance most people miss. They think the only options are hold on tightly or let go completely. But there's a third way, a more aligned way. You can care without clinging. You can desire without controlling. You can show up fully without attaching your identity to the outcome. And when you do that, something shifts. Your energy opens. Your interactions become lighter. Your presence becomes more natural. And most importantly, you create space. Space for things to breathe. Space for things to evolve. Space for what is truly aligned to remain. Because here's the truth. What is meant for you does not require pressure to stay. It requires alignment. And alignment doesn't come from gripping. It comes from allowing. Now imagine approaching your life this way. Instead of asking, how do I keep this? You ask, does this still align with who I am? Instead of trying to control outcomes, you focus on maintaining your state, your clarity, your energy, your direction, and you allow everything else to organize around that. That's power, not control, but alignment. And the more you practice this, the more you'll notice something interesting. The things that are truly aligned become easier to maintain, and the things that aren't naturally begin to fall away, without force, without struggle, without confusion. And instead of resisting that process, you start to trust it, because now you understand loss is not always loss. Sometimes it's misalignment being removed, which brings us back to the deeper theme of this entire journey. Letting go is not about giving up. It's about releasing your grip, so alignment can take over. And once you embody that, you stop chasing stability through control. You start experiencing stability through trust. You've seen the paradox clearly now. Holding on doesn't preserve what you want. It creates pressure that pushes it away. And loosening your grip doesn't create loss. It creates space. But now we need to go one level deeper. Because space is not just a byproduct. It's a requirement. Because here's the truth most people never fully accept. You cannot receive what you're ready for if your life is still full of what you've outgrown. So now the question becomes, what happens when you finally create that space? And what is trying to enter your life that currently has no room to arrive? Let's explore that. Chapter 5. Create space or stay stagnant. There is a principle, so simple, so obvious, that most people overlook it completely. Not because it's complicated, but because it requires honesty. Here it is. You cannot receive what you're ready for if you are still holding on to what you've outgrown. Take a moment and let that really land, because this is where everything begins to shift. Most people are focused on attracting more opportunities, more clarity, more abundance, more alignment. They ask, how do I get what I want? How do I bring something new into my life? How do I move forward? But very few people stop and ask a more important question. Where would it go? If everything you desire arrived today, would there be space for it? Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, energetically. Or would it be competing with everything you're still holding on to? Because here's the core principle. The universe cannot replace what you refuse to release. Not because it's withholding from you, not because you're not deserving, but because there is no room, and life doesn't stack alignment on top of misalignment. It replaces it, but replacement requires space, and space requires release. Now pause for a moment and really look at your life through this lens. Not what you want to add, but what you haven't removed. Because stagnation doesn't come from lack of opportunity. It comes from lack of space. And space is something you create, not something you wait for. Now let's bring this into something tangible. Look at your physical environment, your room, your workspace, your home. Have you ever noticed how clutter affects your energy? Not dramatically, but subtly. You feel it in small ways. A slight heaviness, a lack of clarity, a sense of being overwhelmed without knowing why. And then something interesting happens. You clean, you organize, you remove what you no longer need. And suddenly, everything feels different, not because you added something new, but because you created space. Space for movement, space for clarity, space for ease. Now take that same principle and apply it to your life. Because clutter doesn't just exist physically, it exists emotionally, relationally, mentally. There are conversations you keep revisiting that no longer serve you. There are relationships you maintain out of habit, not alignment. There are thoughts you entertain that reinforce old versions of yourself. And all of that takes up space. Now here's where it becomes real, because you may say, I want something better. But your life is still full of what no longer fits. And the two cannot coexist. Not fully, because one is the past, and the other is the future. And you are standing in the middle, trying to hold both. Which leads to stagnation, not because you're not moving, but because you're not releasing. Now pause again and ask yourself honestly, what are you still holding that's taking up space meant for something better? Don't rush the answer, let it surface. Because you already know it's the thing that comes to mind immediately and then gets pushed away just as quickly. That relationship you've outgrown, that environment that drains you, that pattern that keeps repeating, that identity you've already moved beyond. You feel it, you've felt it, but you haven't released it. And so it stays, not because it's meant to, but because it still has space. And this is where a deeper realization begins to form. Letting go is not about loss. It's about making room. Room for alignment, room for expansion, room for something that actually reflects who you are now. But here's what makes this difficult. Because creating space often comes with a temporary feeling of emptiness. And most people misinterpret that emptiness. They think something is missing, something is wrong. I need to fill this. So they rush. They replace quickly, they distract themselves. They go back to what they released, just to avoid that feeling. But what if that emptiness is not a problem? What if it's a necessary phase? Because that space, that quiet, open, undefined space, is where new alignment begins to form. It's where clarity sharpens. It's where direction becomes visible. It's where something new has the opportunity to enter, but only if you allow it. Only if you don't rush to fill it with something familiar. Now think about this. Every time you've experienced a major shift in your life, there was a space before it. A moment where things felt uncertain, undefined, open. And then, something new appeared. A new opportunity, a new direction, a new connection. But it didn't arrive while you were holding on to the old. It arrived after you created space. This is the rhythm most people resist. Release, then receive. Not the other way around. Because receiving without releasing creates overload, but releasing first creates alignment. Now imagine approaching your life with this understanding. Instead of constantly trying to add, you begin by subtracting. You remove what feels heavy, you release what feels forced. You clear what no longer reflects you, and you trust that what belongs in your life will naturally fill that space. Not randomly, but precisely. Because once space exists, alignment has somewhere to land. And this is where stagnation ends. Not when you find something new, but when you make room for it. Which brings us back to the core truth of this entire journey. You're not waiting for your next level to appear. You're preparing for it to arrive. And the preparation is release. You've now seen something clearly. Your life doesn't expand when you add more. It expands when you create space. You've recognized what you're holding on to. You've felt the weight of it, and you've begun to understand why nothing new can fully enter while it remains. But now we need to go deeper. Because if letting go creates space, and space allows alignment, then why is it so hard to release? Why do you hesitate, even when you know something no longer fits? Because the answer is not practical. It's psychological. It's not about what you're holding on to. It's about what you believe will happen if you let it go. And those beliefs, they are not always true. They are learned, conditioned, repeated. So now it's time to uncover them. Chapter 6. Your fear is not truth. It's programming. There's a reason. You don't let go immediately. Even when you know something is misaligned, even when you feel the weight of it, even when you recognize it's already over. You hesitate, you pause, you tell yourself to wait a little longer, and on the surface, it looks like uncertainty. But underneath that hesitation, there is something much deeper. Fear. Not loud fear, not obvious fear, but quiet, persistent fear. The kind that sounds like logic, the kind that feels reasonable, the kind that convinces you that holding on is the safer option. Now pause for a moment and really notice this in yourself. When you think about letting go of something, what thoughts immediately appear? Maybe this is a mistake. What if nothing better comes? What if I regret this? What if I lose more than I gain? Those thoughts don't feel emotional. They feel practical. They feel responsible. They feel like you're thinking things through. But what if those thoughts are not truth? What if they are something else entirely? Because here's the deeper insight. The fear of letting go is actually the fear of emptiness. Let that settle. It's not the loss of the thing itself. It's what you believe comes after. The space, the unknown, the absence of what used to be there. And that space feels uncomfortable. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's unfamiliar. And the mind does something interesting. When it encounters the unfamiliar, it fills it with fear. Not because something is wrong, but because it has no reference point. Now here's where it gets even more important. Because that fear you feel is not something you were born with. It was learned, conditioned, repeated over time. You were taught, directly or indirectly, that losing something is bad, that emptiness means something is missing, that uncertainty is something to avoid. So now, whenever you approach a moment of release, your mind activates those patterns. It says, don't do this. This is risky. This could go wrong. But here's the twist that changes everything. That fear is not predicting your future. It's protecting your past. Let that land. Because this is where most people misunderstand fear completely. They think fear is a warning about what might happen. But in many cases, fear is simply a memory, a pattern, a familiar response designed to keep you within known territory, even if that territory no longer serves you. Now think about that. Your fear is not trying to guide you toward expansion. It's trying to keep you within what you've already experienced, within what feels familiar, within what feels controlled, within what feels predictable. But here's the problem. Your past is not where your future exists. So when you let fear guide your decisions, you don't move forward. You repeat. You stay within the same patterns, the same environments, the same dynamics, the same limitations. Not because you're meant to, but because your programming is keeping you there. Now pause again and really observe this in your life. Where are you choosing familiarity over alignment? Where are you staying in something, not because it feels right, but because it feels known? Because known feels safe, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's draining, even when it's clearly no longer aligned. And that's the trap. Confusing familiarity with safety, when in reality, familiarity often keeps you stuck. Now let's go deeper, because beneath the fear of emptiness, there is another layer, a belief, a core assumption that shapes how you see everything. And that belief is this: if I let go, there won't be enough. Not enough connection, not enough opportunity, not enough security, not enough support. This is what we call a lack mentality, and it operates quietly. You don't always notice it, but it shows up in your decisions, in your hesitation, in your resistance to release. Because if you believe that letting go leads to loss, then holding on feels logical. But here's the truth. Letting go doesn't create lack. It reveals abundance. But you can't experience that if you never move past the fear. So now comes one of the most important moments in this entire journey. A moment of reflection. Not surface-level thinking, but honest awareness. Ask yourself this: what do I believe will happen if I let go? Don't filter it. Don't make it sound positive. Just be honest. What is the actual fear? Is it loneliness? Is it instability? Is it failure? Is it regret? Let it surface. And now ask the second question. Is that actually true? Not does it feel true, but is it objectively, undeniably true? Or is it a story based on past experiences, repeated so many times that it feels real? Because this is where your power begins. Not in eliminating fear, but in seeing it clearly, in recognizing that it is not truth, it is programming, and programming can be changed, but only when you stop treating it as reality. Now imagine what happens when you begin to separate fear from truth, when you feel the fear, but don't automatically obey it, when you hear the thoughts, but question them, when you create space between your reaction and your awareness. Something shifts. You become less reactive, less controlled by old patterns, more present, more intentional, and slowly, you begin to make different choices. Not because the fear disappears, but because you no longer treat it as authority. And that changes everything. Because now, letting go doesn't feel like jumping into the unknown blindly. It feels like stepping beyond a boundary that was never actually real. Which brings us back to the core theme. Letting go is not about removing something from your life. It's about removing the illusion. that you need it to be okay. And once that illusion fades, fear loses its grip, not completely, but enough for you to move. Enough for you to choose alignment over familiarity. You've now seen something clearly. The fear that keeps you holding on is not truth. It's programming. It's not guiding your future. It's protecting your past. And once you begin to see that, you loosen its control. But now, we need to go even deeper. Because something happens when you continue to resist change. Even after you recognize the fear, life begins to respond. Not gently, but unmistakably. Because if you don't choose to evolve, something will choose for you. And when that happens, it doesn't feel like guidance. It feels like everything is falling apart. But what if it's not? What if it's something else entirely? Let's uncover it. Chapter 7. You're being moved, not broken. There are moments in life where everything begins to feel unstable, not slightly uncomfortable, not mildly uncertain, but genuinely disorienting. Plans fall apart, expectations collapse, things you thought were secure suddenly shift. And in those moments, the first thought that usually appears is this: something is wrong. Something is going wrong. Something is breaking. Something is being lost. And the emotional response follows quickly. Stress, overwhelm, resistance. You try to fix it, control it, stabilize it. You try to put things back the way they were. But what if that's the one thing you're not meant to do? Because what if those moments are not signs that your life is breaking? What if they are signs that your life is moving? Let's slow this down, because this is one of the most important reframes you will ever understand. Chaos is not random. Chaos is forced alignment. Let that settle. Because chaos doesn't usually appear without warning. It builds quietly, subtly, through the things you've already felt. The misalignment you noticed, the friction you experienced, the awareness you ignored. And when that awareness is not acted on, life responds. Not to punish you, but to move you. Because here's the truth. When you resist voluntary growth, growth doesn't stop. It becomes involuntary, and that's when it feels like chaos. Now think about a time in your life when something fell apart. At the time, it probably felt overwhelming, unfair even. You may have asked, why is this happening? Why now? Why me? But look at it from where you are now. Did that moment lead to something new? A new direction, a new perspective, a new version of yourself? Did it move you, even if you didn't choose the movement? Because often, when you look back, you realize something surprising. That moment wasn't destruction, it was redirection. But you couldn't see it at the time, because when you're in the middle of change, it rarely feels like alignment. It feels like loss. It feels like instability. It feels like everything you were holding on to is no longer holding you. And that's where this anchor becomes essential. Something you return to again and again, until it becomes how you see everything. This isn't falling apart. This is being rearranged. Say that to yourself. Not once, but every time something feels uncertain, every time something shifts unexpectedly, every time something leaves your life that you thought would stay. Because rearrangement doesn't always feel gentle. Sometimes it's disruptive. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes it removes things you weren't ready to release. But it always serves a purpose. To align your external reality with your internal evolution. Now pause for a moment and reflect on your current life again. Where does it feel like things are shifting? Where does it feel like something is changing, even if you don't fully understand it yet? And instead of asking, "How do I stop this?" ask a different question. What is this trying to move me toward? Because chaos always has direction. Even when it feels random, even when it feels overwhelming, there is always a movement happening beneath it. A reorganization, a realignment, and your experience of that process depends on one thing: whether you resist it or cooperate with it. Now this is where the curiosity begins. Because most people instinctively resist. They try to hold on to what's changing. They try to maintain what's dissolving. They try to control what is clearly moving. And that resistance creates more friction, more stress, more intensity. Because now you're not just experiencing change. You're fighting it. But what happens if you stop resisting, not giving up, not becoming passive, but choosing to cooperate, choosing to trust that something is shifting for a reason? What happens then? Everything softens. The experience changes. You still move, but without the same level of struggle. You still transition, but with more clarity, because you're no longer trying to stay where you've outgrown. You're allowing yourself to move forward. Now imagine approaching your life this way. When something begins to shift, instead of tightening your grip, you loosen it. Instead of asking how to fix it, you ask what it's revealing. Instead of assuming something is wrong, you consider that something is aligning. That shift in perspective changes everything. Because now, you're not a victim of change. You're a participant in it. And that's where your power returns. Because when you cooperate with movement, you begin to move intentionally. You start making decisions from awareness instead of reaction. You begin releasing what no longer fits before it has to be taken. And that's where chaos transforms. From something that happens to you into something that works for you. Now let's bring this back to the core idea. Letting go. Because everything we've explored leads here. If you release when you feel the misalignment, you move smoothly. But if you hold on, life will create the movement for you. And that movement often feels like disruption. So in reality, you're always being guided toward alignment. The only difference is how you experience it. Voluntary release or forced change. Ease or intensity. Flow or chaos. And once you understand that, your relationship with change transforms. You stop fearing it. You start recognizing it. You stop resisting it. You start moving with it. Which brings us back to that anchor one more time. This isn't falling apart. This is being rearranged. Not randomly, not unfairly, but precisely, in ways that are aligning you with something more accurate, more expansive, more true to who you are becoming. You've now seen something clearly. What feels like chaos is not destruction, it's movement, it's alignment being forced when it wasn't chosen. And once you understand that, you gain something powerful. Choice. Because now you don't have to wait for life to rearrange things for you. You can move first. You can release intentionally. You can evolve before the pressure builds. So now the question becomes, what happens when you stop waiting for things to fall apart and choose to let go before they do? Because there is a very different experience on the other side of that decision. One that is not driven by chaos, but by clarity. Let's step into that. There is a moment that quietly appears in every person's life. A moment that doesn't demand attention, but invites it. A moment where something feels off, not dramatically wrong, not completely broken, just misaligned. You notice it in small ways: a lack of energy, a sense of resistance, a feeling that something has run its course. And in that moment, you are given a choice. Not a loud one, not an urgent one, but a clear one. You can release, or you can wait. And most people choose to wait, not because they don't know, not because they can't feel it, but because letting go feels premature. It feels unnecessary. It feels like you might be giving up too soon. So instead, you stay, you adjust, you tolerate, you try to make it work. And for a while, nothing dramatic happens. Life continues, things function. You convince yourself, maybe it's fine. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe this is just part of the process. But underneath that surface, something is building. Because here's the truth most people don't want to face. If you don't release what's misaligned, life will increase the pressure until you do. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, consistently, precisely. Now pause for a moment and reflect on your past. Think about a time when something ended in your life, not gently, but forcefully. A burnout, a breakdown, a sudden shift you didn't expect. At the time, it probably felt overwhelming, maybe even unfair. You may have thought, why is this happening like this? Why did it have to get this bad? Why didn't I see this coming? But if you look closer, you'll notice something important. There were signs, small ones at first, easy to ignore, moments of discomfort, feelings of misalignment, subtle awareness that something wasn't quite right, and you felt them, you noticed them, but you didn't act on them. So they grew. They became harder to ignore, more consistent, more present, until eventually they reached a point where they could no longer be overlooked. And that's when life intervened, not as punishment, but as progression, because growth was already happening. You just hadn't chosen it yet, so it was chosen for you. Now let's bring this into something real. Burnout. Burnout doesn't appear overnight. It builds through overextension, through misalignment, through staying in something that no longer energizes you. At first, it's manageable. You feel tired, but you push through. You feel drained, but you keep going, and you tell yourself, this is normal. This is temporary. I just need to try harder. But the signals continue, and because they're ignored, they intensify. Until one day, you can't push anymore. Not because you're weak, but because you've reached the limit of what misalignment can sustain. And suddenly, you're forced to stop. Now think about relationships. They rarely end suddenly. They unravel through disconnection, through lack of growth, through subtle shifts in energy. You feel it early, that change in dynamic. That loss of flow, that quiet sense that something is different, but instead of addressing it, you adapt, you compensate, you try to restore what used to be, and for a while, it seems stable, until it's not, until something breaks. An argument, a realization, a moment that changes everything, and suddenly, what you are holding on to is no longer there. Not gradually, but all at once. Now consider sudden life changes, unexpected shifts, moments where everything rearranges quickly. You lose something, you're moved somewhere, your path changes direction overnight, and it feels abrupt. But is it really, or is it the result of something that's been building beneath the surface for a long time? Because here's the harsh truth. Life doesn't create misalignment. It reveals it. And when misalignment is ignored, it doesn't disappear. It amplifies until it demands action. So now the question becomes, do you want to move? when it's calm and clear, or when it's intense and unavoidable. Because those are the two paths: voluntary release or forced change. And the difference between them is awareness acted upon. Now pause again and bring this back to your present life. Where are you feeling the early signals? Where is there subtle discomfort? Where do you sense something is ending, but hasn't fully ended yet? And more importantly, what are you doing about it? Are you acknowledging it, or are you waiting? Because waiting doesn't pause the process. It progresses it, and the longer you wait, the more intense the shift becomes. Now here's where your power comes in. Because you are not meant to wait for life to escalate things. You are meant to move with awareness, to recognize misalignment early, to trust what you feel, to release before the pressure builds. And this is your coaching challenge. Not to make dramatic decisions, not to act impulsively, but to do something far more powerful. Instead of reacting to chaos, you respond to clarity. Instead of waiting for things to fall apart, you move when they no longer align. Instead of being forced into change, you step into it willingly. Now imagine what your life would feel like if you lived this way. If you trusted your awareness early, if you honored the signals when they were subtle, if you released with clarity instead of waiting for intensity, your transitions would feel smoother, your energy would feel lighter, your growth would feel intentional, because you're no longer being pushed. You're choosing to move, and that is the shift that changes everything, because now, letting go is not something you do out of necessity. It's something you do out of alignment, out of self-trust, out of understanding that growth doesn't need to hurt when it is chosen early. Which brings us back to the core truth. Letting go is not about waiting until you have no choice. It's about recognizing that you already do. And once you begin to live from that place, life stops needing to escalate. Because you're already listening, you've now seen the pattern clearly. When you ignore misalignment, life increases the intensity until you act. But when you choose to release early, something very different happens. Something most people never fully experience because they wait too long to see it. Because here's the truth. Letting go doesn't just prevent chaos, it accelerates something else. Something powerful, something precise, something that begins the moment you release. So now the question becomes, what actually happens when you let go before you're forced to? What begins to move the moment you create that space? Let's step into that. Chapter 9. Receive faster by releasing first. There is a moment, right after you let go of something, that most people misunderstand. It doesn't always feel like relief immediately. It doesn't always feel like clarity right away. Sometimes it feels quiet, open, undefined, almost empty. And if you're not aware of what's happening, you might misinterpret that moment. You might think, nothing is happening. Maybe I made the wrong decision. Maybe I let go too soon. But what if that moment is not absence? What if it's activation? Because here's the principle that changes everything. The moment you release, you send a signal, not just psychologically, but energetically. A signal that says, I am ready for something new. I am no longer available for what I've outgrown. I trust that something aligned can replace this. And that signal creates movement, not visible at first, not immediate in form, but real, precise, already in motion. Now pause for a moment and think about your past again. Have you ever let go of something and later realized that something better entered your life? Not always instantly, but clearly. A better opportunity, a healthier connection, a clearer path. And when you look back, you see the sequence. You see that the new thing could not have arrived while you were still holding on to the old one, because there was no space, no availability, no alignment. So the moment you released, everything began to reorganize. Now here's where it becomes powerful. Because most people focus on receiving, they ask, how do I attract more? How do I bring something better into my life? How do I speed up results? But they overlook the first step, the one that actually initiates the process. Release. Because receiving is not something you force, it's something you allow. And allowance begins when you remove what's in the way. Now let's go deeper into this. Because releasing is not just a physical action, it's an identity signal. When you let go of something misaligned, you are not just removing it from your life. You are declaring something about yourself. You are saying, I no longer identify with this. This no longer reflects who I am. I am available for something different. And that declaration matters, because your life organizes itself around who you believe you are. So when your identity shifts, your reality follows. Not instantly, but inevitably. Now here's the shift that most people never fully make. They let go, but they expect loss. They release something, but they prepare for absence. They create space, but they assume it will stay empty. And that expectation shapes their experience. Because if you expect loss, you interpret space as lack. You interpret quiet as emptiness. You interpret transition as uncertainty. But what if you change that expectation? What if you became someone who expects replacement? Not randomly, not blindly, but intentionally. What if every time you let go, you assumed something better was already on its way? How would that change the way you feel? How would that change the way you release? Because now, letting go doesn't feel like risk. It feels like alignment. It feels like trust. It feels like participation in something bigger. And this is where the identity shift happens. You stop being someone who fears loss. You become someone who anticipates upgrade. Let that settle. Because this is not about blind optimism. It's about pattern recognition. Look at your life again. Every time you've truly outgrown something and eventually released it, what happened next? Did you stay in emptiness forever? Or did something new eventually appear? Something more aligned, more reflective of who you had become. Now imagine recognizing that pattern in real time. Not after the fact, but during the process. As you release, as you create space, as you step into the unknown, instead of fear, you feel expectation, not anxiety, but awareness, because now you understand something most people don't. Release is not the end of the process. It is the beginning of reception. And once you internalize that, your entire relationship with letting go transforms. You no longer hesitate the same way. You no longer cling out of fear. You no longer delay what you already know, because you trust the sequence. Release, then receive. Now pause for a moment and feel into this truth. Every time you let go, something better has already started moving toward you. You may not see it yet. You may not know what it is. You may not know when it will arrive. But the movement has already begun. Because alignment has been created. And alignment always attracts. Not randomly, but specifically. Based on who you are now, not who you were. And that's the key. Because what comes next in your life is not based on what you want. It's based on what you align with. And alignment is created through release. Now imagine living with this understanding. Instead of asking, "What if nothing comes?" you ask, "What is already on its way?" Instead of fearing the unknown, you become curious about it. Instead of holding on, you open up. And that openness is what accelerates everything, because now you're not just allowing change, you're expecting it. And expectation is powerful because it shifts your focus, it shifts your energy, it shifts how you interpret everything that follows. You begin noticing opportunities sooner, you recognize alignment faster, you move with more clarity because you are no longer anchored to the past. You are oriented toward what's emerging, which brings us back to the deeper truth. Letting go is not about creating emptiness. It's about activating what's next. And once you see that clearly, you stop fearing the space. You start trusting it. You've now stepped into something powerful. You understand that letting go doesn't create loss. It creates movement. It signals readiness. It activates what is already beginning to align with you. And most importantly, you've begun shifting your identity from someone who fears release to someone who expects expansion. But now we move into the final layer. Because this isn't just about letting go once. This is about becoming someone who lives this way, who evolves continuously, who doesn't cling because they understand something deeper. So now the question becomes, what would your life look like if you stopped trying to hold on to anything permanently and instead became someone who naturally outgrows everything? Let's step into that. Chapter 10. Become someone who outgrows everything. A rhythm of expansion and release. A rhythm of growth and letting go. A rhythm that whispers a simple truth. You are not meant to maintain. You are meant to evolve. Think about it for a moment. Everything in nature evolves through release. A tree sheds leaves in autumn, not because it wants to die, but because shedding is essential for the new growth that will come in spring. A river carves a new path, not by clinging to its old banks, but by flowing past resistance, by letting go of where it once was. And in the same way, your life is not meant to be held tight. It is not meant to be preserved. It is not meant to remain fixed. You are meant to outgrow, not sometimes, not in fits and starts, consistently, relentlessly. Every experience you encounter, every relationship, every job, every pattern of thought is a mirror reflecting your current frequency, your current self. And when something no longer reflects who you are or who you are becoming, you're not failing. You are evolving. Now pause and reflect. How many times have you tried to force continuity? How many times have you held on to something because it felt safe, familiar, or expected? And yet, deep down, you already sensed that it was time to move on. That sensing is the key. That sensing is the pulse of evolution. It is the universe giving you a subtle invitation. You have outgrown this. Step into something larger. But here is the paradox that almost everyone misses. Outgrowing is not a one-time act. It is a lifestyle, a constant practice of noticing, releasing, and stepping forward. And it begins with identity. You must begin to see yourself as someone who naturally evolves. Someone who does not cling to outdated versions of life, thought, or self. Someone who trusts endings as much as beginnings. Because here is the deepest truth. Every ending is a signpost. Every release is a signal. Every letting go is an invitation. And the more you live this way, the less fear you have of endings. The less resistance you feel to the natural flow of life. The less chaos has the power to disrupt you. You begin to live in alignment with your highest frequency. And when that happens, you stop being surprised by life. You stop resisting change. You stop wondering if what is ending was too soon, too late, or too much. You simply move with clarity, with purpose, with trust. Because you know the truth. You're not losing, you are outgrowing. You are not breaking, you are expanding. You are not empty, you are creating space for what is next. Now take a moment to imagine this as a full practice. What would it feel like to greet every ending with curiosity? To see every shift, every loss, every sudden change as an opportunity to become more aligned with who you are truly meant to be. To trust that the universe is always replenishing, always redirecting, always bringing you closer to the version of yourself you have outgrown into. This is the final challenge of Chapter 10, and it ties everything together. Your life is a series of endings and beginnings, and the faster, the more consciously, and the more fully you release what no longer serves you. The faster, the more intentionally, and the more fully you receive what aligns with your evolution. So pause and reflect one last time. What would your life look like if you trusted every ending? If you knew without doubt that letting go is not loss, but acceleration? If every release became a deliberate act of creation, of self-alignment, of quantum expansion? Hold that thought. Let it settle. Because when you leave this chapter, you carry something that most people spend a lifetime searching for. The understanding that growth is the highest form of trust in yourself. The practice of outgrowing everything you have outgrown. The ability to live your life intentionally aligned and expansive. And now, with that awareness planted deep within you, it is time to close this journey. You've learned the patterns of misalignment, the signals of resistance, the quantum power of release, and the inevitability of growth. You've seen how letting go intentionally creates momentum, how identity shapes reality, and how outgrowing is not optional. It's essential. Now, in the final moments, let's integrate this into your daily life and step fully into the person who lives by these principles. In closing, there is a version of you waiting on the other side of release. Not a version that is struggling, not a version that is forcing, not a version that is trying to hold everything together, but a version that moves differently. A version that understands something deeply. Nothing meant for you requires you to grip it tightly. And nothing that leaves you was ever aligned with who you are becoming. Now think about your life. Not the life you've been managing, but the life you've been feeling pulled toward. The ideas, the shifts, the quiet knowing that something more is available. That's not imagination, that's direction. But here's the decision you've been avoiding. You cannot step into that life while holding on to the one that no longer fits. So the question becomes, what are you ready to release? Not someday, not when it feels safe, but now. Because the moment you let go, space is created. And in that space, something new begins organizing itself around you. Opportunities you couldn't see, people you couldn't access, experiences that match who you are now, not who you were. This is the rhythm: release, receive, expand, repeat. So here's your challenge. Today, identify one thing you've been holding on to out of fear and make a decision. Not a dramatic one, not a reckless one, but a clear one. A conscious release, because the life you want is not built by holding on. It's revealed the moment you finally let go.